Hello and welcome to this webinar on EN Beyond WCAG requirements. We have 472 people registered for this webinar. I don't expect exactly everyone to show up live because it is, of course, recorded, so you can repeatedly listen to it again and again and again if you can't get enough of the EN requirements. This webinar is automatically captioned, and you can use the CC functionality in Zoom to get the captions. And if you would like to ask a question, please do so by using the Q&A function. It is much easier for us to follow the questions in the Q&A function than in the chat, but you're welcome to chit-chat with your fellow participants in the chat, of course. Your camera and microphone has been disabled to avoid distractions, and it is possible to use the raise hand function if you prefer to ask your question verbally, but it's usually smoother if we get them in writing. So my name is Susanna Lorin, and I'm the IAAP representative to the EU. And today we will also hear from my very distinguished colleagues, Ditlev Fischer out of Germany from DIAS, Malin Hammerberg, who is working at the Funke Foundation, but also a member of the IAAP Nordic Advisory Council, Peter Kemeny, also from the Foundation, and Wilco Fears from DQ. And we will not hear from Hidde de Vries, who was in the actual workshop where we are reporting from. So I will try my best to report after his very good notes. We are going to give a little bit of a background to this series of workshops and webinars that we are doing, and then we are presenting not 4, but actually 5 requirements, including Q&A. And then talking a little bit in the wrap-up how you can contribute, and also talk about the upcoming events, because this is not the end, this is just the beginning. The background of this is, of course, that the EU legislation requires EN standards. So even though we have a global standard called WCAG that most people know about, when the EU is regulating or legislating around accessibility, we need European standards. And for the Web Accessibility Directive, there is a specific annex in the EN 301549, which is the mothership of all the accessibility standards, at least in Europe. And in Annex A, you can see what is called the presumed conformance, which means that if you meet those requirements or the technical specifications of this annex in the standard, then you can be pretty sure that you're also meeting the requirements in the legislation. So that's all fine, but there are more than 60 requirements, I think 63 or maybe 64 requirements in that list that is not referencing WCAG. So many of the requirements that goes for web and apps are referencing WCAG, but as you probably know, the EN is much broader and covers all ICT. But even when it comes to web and apps, there are requirements that are not pointing to WCAG. So these are what we call beyond WCAG. That means that the requirements do not have understanding documents, and also they don't have the W3C techniques, which is usually how people interpret the standards and make sure that we all understand what the requirements is. That doesn't mean that everyone is exactly aligned with WCAG requirements either, but at least there's much less confusion around those. When it comes to the 60+ requirements in the EN that go beyond WCAG, there has been quite a lot of fragmentation and confusion around the applicability, about interpretation, and about how to test these requirements. And unfortunately, this is fragmentation and confusion for all stakeholders around. The member states monitoring agencies, some of them have started to create their own documents and own interpretations of this. Which is, of course, it's good that they do something, but when they do different things, and we have several examples of monitoring agencies who deem something to be legal in one country, and then another monitoring agency in another member state that says, no, this is not how we interpret this, that is not good. And that's definitely not the intention of the EU legislation. And here comes the European Accessibility Act, came in June. Then we can foresee even more fragmentation. So what IAAP, the EU program of IAAP, what we have started doing already in 2002 or early 2022, sorry, is to make sure that stakeholders get together, monitoring agencies, accessibility specialists, end users with disabilities, and when it comes to the WAD, public sector bodies, so everyone in scope of the legislation, and let them discuss together to make sure that we can end up with some kind of idea of application and testing and so on that everyone agrees on. So we have our facilitators, and except the ones participating in today, as I said, Hidde de Vries from the Dutch government IT department Logius, and Shadi Abuzara, previously with W3C, now with Amazon, also a facilitator in these workshops. And together we have agreed to spend time, our free time, to make sure that we move forward on this. And the goal has always been to create a formal document that would be an not a normative, but an informative document in the European standardization universe or environment. So far we have not succeeded, but let's not give up. I hope to do this before I retire at least. And even if we don't succeed in making it a formal standardization document, then at least it will be open to all and community based. So this is not a branded anything. Anything you learn from today or you find good or bad, you can use it as you like. It's none of the companies or organizations behind this, the workshops. We don't own any of this. We share with everyone. And after this meeting today, we will also share a document with notes where you can read more about all the presentations we are doing now, because it's going to be quite a short, quick overview. So when we celebrated the Web Accessibility Directive 5th anniversary in September, we had a workshop the day before, and this was the first time we had an online workshop. So we were a little bit, we didn't know if it would be successful or not, but I think we all agreed that it was actually quite a nice experience. And now we are going to present the results from these workshops, starting with we're going through 5.3 biometrics, 7.3 user control of audiovisual accessibility features, 11.7 user preferences, 12.2 accessible information about services, and 12.3 accessibility and compatibility features. We have not managed to go through all the 60 requirements yet, but this time we made kind of a compilation of what we have done before and compared it with the actual new draft 4.1.1. So this is the update from these 5 discussions that we have had. And we are starting with Malin. If she is still around.
I am, but when you moved your mouse, my program went away. Hi, so I was doing the biometrics. This is the second time we're revisiting this, as Susanna said. So let's look at how it looked before and how it looked in the latest draft. So in version 3.2.1, the current version, we can read that where ICT uses biological characteristic, it shall not rely on the use of a particular biological characteristics as the only means of use identification or for control of ICT. And then there are 2 notes: alternative means of use identification or for control of ICT could be non-biometric or biometric. And note 2, biometric method based on dissimilar biological characteristics increase the likelihood that individuals with disabilities possess at least one of the specified biological characteristics. Examples of dissimilar biological characteristics, that's a hard word, are fingerprints, eye retinal patterns, voice, and face. So in short, in this version, it says if you use biometrics, for instance, fingerprint, you need to give another alternative, which can be, for instance, another biometric identification like face recognition. So in the latest draft, it's much shorter. We instead read, where ICT use biological characteristic, the ICT shall not rely on the use of a biological characteristic as the only means of use identification or for control of the ICT. Note, some examples of biological characteristics are fingerprint, eye retinal patterns, voice, and face. So now it reads that if you use biometrics, that's fine, but you need to use something else than biometrics as a second use identification or for control. In Annex B, the primary relationship was usage without vision, usage with limited vision, usage without hearing, usage without local capability, usage with limited manipulation or strength, and usage with limited reach and privacy. And in the latest draft, also usage with limited hearing is added, which was something that we talked about when we had the workshop the first time, that we are missing. We are missing users with limited hearing in the list, but we are also missing. The workshop group also noted that usage with cognitive disabilities was also missing from this list. This is not added in the current draft. And then we have Annex C. And in Annex C, we can find the testing methodology, how to test the requirement itself. And it was divided into two tests, one test for use identification and one test for control of ICT. In the latest draft, there is still combined into one single test. And I will just read the single test because it's similar to the ones before. So the requirement precondition is that the ICT uses biological characteristics for use identification or for control of ICT. Procedure, check that another means that does not rely on biological characteristics can be used for user identification or control of ICT. And then the result is pass, fail, or not applicable. So if we do a comparison of these, we can see that the approach changed from requiring biometric alternative to requiring a non-biometric alternative. The primary usage relationship extended to limiting hearing, and identification and control no longer had separate tests, which created some kind of confusion. When is it a control? When is it a use for identification? Why do I need to test it with two different methods? There's, however, still some remaining concerns that we noted in the current workshop. And for example, that alternative, nowhere is mentioned that needs to be accessible alternative. So for instance, if we have an inaccessible logging methods or identification methods, and the accessible alternative is a biometric alternative, for instance, fingerprint, and that part is accessible. So it's an accessible alternative to non-accessible identification methods, then this requirement kind of falls a bit short. So what we were talking about in the workshop is that although now requires non-biometric alternative, doesn't ensure that the alternative themselves are accessible. So the requirement should kind of give a statement that the alternative method needs to fulfill the other requirements in the EN 31549. And then we have limited scope, the requirement limited to the identification and control only. And we talked about what this means. Are there any situations where this can be required that's not included into those two terms? And what we would like to see is that it says or any other purpose. So we kind of do it a bit future-proof and see if biometric is used for anything else, it should still be an accessible alternative. users with cognitive and the gap in group coverage, as I mentioned, users with cognitive disabilities still not considered as a relevant user group, and they should be added at least as a secondary user group. Is our summary of it all. And then we tried to do some kind of testing support on the requirement. So we said that alternative method must not rely on biological carriers and must be genuinely accessible to an intended user group. So we thought about fail examples. So when there is no alternative to the biometrics, then of course that's a fail. And if the only alternative to the biometrics is another biometric alternative, that is also a fail then. And on the positive side, pass examples. So we talked about complex solutions. So for instance, when the ICT uses a built-in functionality for user identification of a smartphone, the built-in functionality of the smartphone provides a non-biometric alternative. Is that a pass? And we agree that it should be a pass. And then we had another example, the ICT uses functionality for user identification developed as part of the actual ICT. The ICT itself provides a non-biometric alternative. That's also a pass. And that's, I don't have a question slide, so.
Thank you. Thank you, Malin. So here we have the first question. Accessible alternative for biometrics. I can't think of an alternative that is provided in a way that cannot be tested with other success criteria. So if there is, for example, an alternative that fails 9.2.5.1 pointer gestures. I can't think of an alternative that is provided in a way that cannot be tested. So if there, for example, yes, yeah.
I don't know what the question is, sorry.
I think then it fails anyway because it's so the whole I think the idea is that each of the requirement should not say, in my view, that if you provide an alternative, that alternative also needs to meet all the requirements in the EN 301549. That's kind of self-evident that the alternative needs to be accessible. So this person asks that if they cannot think of an alternative that cannot be tested with another success criteria, and if it fails another success criteria, then it fails anyway. So it doesn't need to be built into this criteria. I think that's the. And I agree with that. I think it's a bit kind of overdoing it to read right in each criteria that, by the way, you need to meet all the other criteria. That's kind of that's not how the standard is done. So I think that's clear. And then we have another question, not specifically on this criteria, but is there any timeline or estimate on when all EN 301549 techniques will be defined? I must say no. We, if this will ever get into the kind of the standardization environment, then there will be funding, and then there will be a call for experts, and then there will be more structure, and people will have to be not only volunteers, but also actually doing this as part of their job. And then there could be a timeline and estimated. But so far, this is just people who tend to be nerdy enough to want to do this in our free time. So we don't have a timeline, unfortunately. But we are just hoping that people will help and that we will move forward as well as we can. So, and I also forgot to say in the introduction that we have had people from the Special Task Force, so the editing staff in the groups in almost all of the, or I think all the workshops we have had. And we can really see that the results of these workshops have been implemented in the current version of the standard. Not everything, but we have really had an impact, which is kind of nice. And Malin also had some examples on that. So no more questions on biometrics. So we could go on to, who is the next?
Peter, I would guess, because I gave him access to the. But I can't move my mouse. I can't. Peter, if you just wait 2 seconds.
Or you just do the clicking for him. That's not a...
Yeah, but I can't.
Okay, maybe now. Can you?
So something is moving at least. So Peter, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, can you see me as well?
Yes.
Okay, great, because yeah, there's a problem that I'm not entering into that. So hi, I'm Peter Kamin. I'm also from the Funke Foundation, and I used to work directly with legislation and standards, so I know how difficult it is, and I will provide some examples about these things that we just mentioned about, for example, having the requirement that everything should be accessible or all the other requirements should be accessible. And also I will connect to another thing that was mentioned. So let's get into it. My topic is user control of audiovisual accessibility features. That's what my group discussed. And this is already the new title of it. The original title of the requirement was user control for captions and audio description. It already shows the huge leap ahead. So very shortly, what is the current criteria, the criteria that's in version 3.2.1? It says that if an ICT primarily displays video and it has associated audio content, then the requirement is that there should be a control available for the user to activate subtitling and audio description. And this control should be at the same level of interaction as the primary media controls. There are many things that are quite ambiguous with this text. So we were happy to see that, hopefully based on our feedback, because it addresses many of those, this is the text that was that's in the draft. So the precondition is that the ICT displays video with synchronized audio, and that the ICT has control over the activation of subtitles and other accessibility features. So if that's given, then this ICT shall provide at least one means of operation that allows the activation of the provided accessibility features, including subtitles, of the user's choice. And it should be done with a single user operation at the same level as the volume control, and it should meet the other accessibility requirements that's in the standard. So that's what we discussed in the short Q&A before. Okay, so what were the key problems we identified and how they are solved with the new text? First of all, the precondition is a bit ambiguous in the current text because it says primarily displaying materials containing video. So the primary, what primary means exactly is not very clear. It possibly limits the scope of this requirement to those videos that are meant to be videos, so not like a preview of a longer video, for example, of a thumbnail. Then it used to say, it says that a video has associated audio content, and this associated audio content is not really something that's in the usual terminology. So the draft text says simply that it displays video, no primarily, and the video has synchronized audio, and this term is what is widely used in the standard and easy to understand. And it also says that the ICT has control over the activation, and this control is there very probably because the primarily limitation is gone. So,
Peter?
yes?
Peter, sorry, we get comments on there's something with your microphone, or I think it's a little bit of an echo or something. So maybe if you can try to adjust
Okay, I try
a little bit, maybe move closer or something.
Try to
What it is.
microphone. Can you still hear me?
Yes, but it's like a small, I don't know, delay or echo or something strange.
Well, I disconnected my microphone, so It
Yeah,
should
that's
be
better.
Okay,
That's
great.
Thank you. Sorry.
So, yeah, thank you very much. So this control is important because, of course, if the ICT has no control, then it cannot actually, this requirement cannot be put through. And with making the primarily disappear, this gap is opened up even more. So there's the text in the draft is easier to understand, uses much common terms as before. So that's the first thing. Then the level of control in the current text is, it says that it should be the same level of interaction, and it kind of explains that it's the same number of steps as the primary media controls. When we discussed it before, one of the main concerns was what is a primary media control? It can be different for different devices. And that has been answered as well, because the text now says same level as the volume control. It's clear. It also adds it should be done with a single user operation. So there must be a button that the user presses, for example, that gets to this activation feature. And the last one is the scope limitation. The text is only about subtitles and audio description, and we question why shouldn't it cover more accessibility features, and the draft actually extended it to subtitles and other accessibility features. It's not moving. Okay. Of the user's choice. One more thing that has changed is that the user groups mentioned where the primary relationship is users without vision, with limited vision, without hearing, and with limited hearing, and the cognitive disabilities, people with cognitive disabilities was identified as a secondary relationship, and it has been now moved to the primary relationship. So what couldn't be done with the biometrics, apparently it did happen here in this requirement. So what we came up when we examined the new requirement? The scope is extended, that's great, but does it mean that there should be control for all the accessibility features? And it says subtitles and accessibility features. Are subtitles prioritized? Is it maybe enough sometimes to fulfill the requirement for subtitles? Then it says that the feature of the user's choice, does it mean that the user can identify one and set it and have a nice customizable button, for example? And that's enough. And the last one is the testing. On the one hand, the testing procedure in the new draft doesn't cover all the requirements. It doesn't cover, for example, that it should be at the same level as the volume controls. But the thing we mentioned before, it does say that it should meet all the accessibility requirements, other accessibility requirements. So what does it mean when we test? Should this requirement be a pass only if all the other requirements are fulfilled? I agree with Susanna, that should be treated separately. So that is a short analysis of what we found, and we are very happy to see that things moved ahead. I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you very much, Peter. Actually, your sound is still a bit difficult to hear, but very good content anyway. So thank you for that. We have the first question is, which multimedia players comply with requirement 7.3? That's one of your favorites.
Yeah. Well, as it is extended much, it's difficult to say. I know when we discussed it, there were players that fulfilled the requirement where it was possible to have the control at the same level as the volume, for example. But I cannot bring an example actually. But there are out there video players or multimedia players that fulfill the requirement.
And can you also say something about why we are now calling it subtitles, where WCAG talks about captions? That's another recurring ones.
Yes, me and I think others were very happy to see as well. The new draft doesn't use the term captions anymore, only subtitles. So that's what we use in Europe now, and it's unambiguous. Captions is also used for the text under table or a figure or an image. So that's one ambiguity. And then it was also used like captions was used for the subtitles in the original language and subtitles was used for everything else. But actually it's not really necessary to make that distinction. So now it's clear and the same term is used all over the standard.
Thank you. And still we refer to WCAG as, when WCAG uses captions, then the WCAG requirement is referred to with captions so that you can find the same thing if you read the EN and then you want to follow that to go to the WCAG things, not with these requirements we are talking about now, but the ones that do have a reference in WCAG. But the European word is subtitles. And thank you everyone for saying that Peter's sound is perfect. It's obviously on my side, that's a problem, but somebody wrote a question on Peter's sound before the audio, and I still can't hear you, but that's good. I hear you every day, so that's fine. I know what you're going to say. So, and just for another question, coming around on the biometrics, can you confirm that in the end cognitive disabilities were left out of biometrics? And yes, it's currently in the current draft. It is not part of the of Annex B. So that is, I can confirm that. But in the end is a little too much because it's still a draft and there are several steps on the way until it's a stable standard. But it's clear. And we have several people saying that they think Able Player complies with requirements 7.3. So that is just to confirm that Peter is right when he says that there are players that meets the requirement, even if we haven't tested it during the workshops. Okay, so now I think it's probably me, if I can control the slides. So 11.7 user preferences. This is a favorite one of all of these requirements that we have been testing or talking about for a long time. And in the first round, when we discussed this, Malin was the facilitator, and in the second round, Hide was the facilitator. Hide couldn't be here today, so I will talk about this. But if you have any further questions, then Malin is the real expert on this one. So in the current version that is public, 3.2.1, user preferences is very ambiguous. So it reads, where software is not designed to be isolated from its platform and provides a user interface. That user interface shall follow the values of the user preferences for platform settings for units of measurement, color, contrast, font type, font size, and focus cursor, except where they are overridden by the user. Note 1. Software that is isolated from its underlying platform has no access to user settings in the platform and thus cannot adhere to them. Note 2. For web content, the underlying platform is the user agent. And note 3, this does not preclude the software from having additional values for a setting as long as there is one mode where the application will follow the system settings even if more restricted. So for many of us working with accessibility, this is kind of a key requirement, extremely important, and it should be kind of self-evident that everything should follow the user settings. However, in reality, it's rather difficult to test. And this is one of the clear examples where the monitoring agencies in different member states interpret this very different. And also in the standardization group, in the joint technical body, we had quite a heated debate at the last meeting around whether dark mode is actually an accessibility setting or just a kind of nice to have user preference. And one could wonder whether a nice to have user preference that people with disabilities use isn't an accessibility setting, or what's the difference between that and how does that leads to many interesting definitions around where usability and accessibility are and what we actually require from a legal standpoint. So this is still a very interesting requirement that we could continue discussing for a very long time, I think. So what happened in the latest draft is that one of the things that we have discussed, and I'm sure many others as well, is that it was too broad and it was not clear what happens with the different types of user agents and platforms and so on. So it's now divided in 3 requirements. So 9.7 is on user preference for web pages, 10.7 is for non-web documents, and 11.7 is the good old user preferences. So we are happy about that. And I will not read all the text here because we have very limited time, but 9.7 on web pages, the text is very similar to 10.7 that has to do with non-web documents. And it says where ICT is or includes a web page or non-web document, the web page shall not block the user agent modes of operation that present the web page according to the user preferences settings or explicitly override user preferences. So we think this is much better. It's much more clear. Shall not block and not explicitly override really clearly tells what is expected from this requirement. So we are quite happy about this improvement. And then from a more technical perspective, maybe, that we talk about the user preferences for documented platform accessibility features, which means that this is kind of much more future-proof instead of pointing to specific settings that exist today. When we just point to the platform accessibility features, that means that the platform may develop new features in the future or better features and so on. So we think these are both very good improvements. And then the rest of the text is also much clearer than before. I won't read all the text on the slides, I'm sorry for that, but it just takes too long. So both 9.7 and 10.7 are essentially the same, but covering different parts. And then 11.7 is kind of the mother requirement here. And the other 2 are pointing to this one as well. So here we can see that when the ICT is a user agent, a web browser or a non-web document or software, this clause implies that at least one mode of operation is offered that enforces a rendering of the content that follows the values of the user preferences. So there must be at least one way of making sure that you meet the user preferences. This is also a clearer way of describing it. I think the intention was the same in the old version, but this is really much more easier to understand. Also, the note 3 that this does not preclude the non-web software from having additional values for settings as long as there is one mode where the application will follow the system settings even if more restricted. So again, this is really close to what the Commission wants to, or the legislator wants to make sure in the legislation, that we open up for innovation, we have technical specifications, and we have requirements for accessibility for the user needs and demands, but we also open up for other possibilities. And then all these documented platform accessibility features that I spoke about earlier, they all point to the user faces that usually include color, contrast, font type, font size, and space adjustment for characters, lines, and paragraphs. So that list has, those examples have been slightly updated. And again, the key here is that the platform accessibility features is in the requirement, but having in the note some examples, we think is a very good idea. So some of the key problems that we saw before has been resolved in the current draft. So there's a clear distinction between web documents and software, which we think makes it much easier and much clearer. The platform accessibility features item makes this much more future-proof than before. And we are also happy to see that many more relevant user groups are added in Annex B. And now I will show you a super big table, which is, you're not supposed to do this from accessibility point of view, but I think at least all sighted users will get an idea that in the previous version, we only had limited vision and without perception of color, only 2 primary relationships here. And then we have used with limited cognition as a secondary relationship. And now we have all the user groups in 9.7, 10.7, and 11.7 The only thing is that we don't have usage without vocal capability in 9.7. So that is a big improvement according to us, and hopefully our discussions and the workshops have been at least pushing in this direction. I'm sure we were not alone, but still. We do have some remaining concerns, or maybe emerging concerns from 411, and that is that kind of this discussion. And here we don't really agree, all of us in the different groups, but there are some people who really miss the list that was removed. The list had problems because it was seen as, so our recommendation from the workshops was that the list would be, for example, but not limited to, so that you would have some examples, but you could add more. That list has been completely removed. So that is not what we wanted, but still it's a much better wording now. And then there's still an issue with understanding how to test this. So what is the sufficient combination of user agents, accessibility features, and assistive technology? How do you do that? How do you do when people have, how do you test it when people have more than one user preference and so on? So there are still things in the testing part that is not clear. And then the group also, the last time, discussed the definitions on mode of operation, accessibility settings, and user preferences that seems to sometimes be used a little bit for similar things without being really clearly defined. Also in Annex C, there is a mentioning of that you need to check each case where the user preferences is explicitly overridden to identify whether meeting the user preferences would fundamentally alter the information or function of the web page or non-web document. And what does that actually mean, to fundamentally alter the information or function? That's also not really defined, but it's very interesting as it also connects to the EAA when it comes to fundamental alteration. So big improvements, but still quite a few things to be done. And I think I overrode my time here, and I know there's a lot of questions around this, but I want to make sure that my colleagues get to speak. So I will leave the floor now to the next speaker, whom I'm not sure who it is, but somebody with control over the slides will know that. Wilco, welcome.
Probably me. Hello.
Yes. Hello.
All right, looks like I've got screen share. Hello, everybody. My name is Wilco Fierce. I'm based in the Netherlands. I've been involved in accessibility standard for years and years and years, and I work for DQ Systems. And we had a look at accessible information about services. This one, there we go, was rather long. This was actually 3 requirements, and I'm definitely not going to read them all because we forget about them. In the latest draft, all 3 of them have been scrapped and replaced with a much shorter version of it, which I really appreciate. And this version reads, where ICT is or includes information about a service made available in a digital form, the presentation of the information shall conform to the requirements of Clause 9 if it is available in a web form, Clause 10 if it's available in a non-web form, and Clause 11 if it's part of a non-web software. Note, the terms in the preconditions of this requirement include support services. So essentially, what this says is your support documentation needs to conform to EN 31549. Basically, it is actually a really nice and concise new requirement that I really appreciate them coming up with, instead of this thing that they had here before with its 4 nodes and 3 requirements. And the annex themselves have not changed dramatically either. There's a little bit more verbose language around them, but it comes down to essentially the same thing. The nice little addition of this version is related to include software instead of just web and non-web documents. So that's been added. I didn't include a slide for Annex B, but the only change really is that privacy has been added, which hooray, I like that. That's a good improvement. Looking at the problems that we identified in the current version 3.2.1, that came down to definition of docs. Like what is product documentation? What counts as that? Can features be self-documented? Like if you have a button with a little description on it, is that self-documentation? That was an open question. That was kind of tricky to answer. There was, what does it mean to accommodate users? There's some requirement of accommodating the communication needs of people with disabilities. It wasn't clear what that actually meant. Probably that meant just follow the spec, which is what it's been turned into now. And then lastly, I already mentioned that software was documentation of software or in software was not included in the previous current version. So looking at how that's changed, these first two are just gone by that rewrites, just taken out, and the software docs thing has been added in. So cool. That didn't address everything though. We took a closer look at the Senate, and particularly the thing that jumped out at us and that we really needed to talk through to figure out what it meant was this word included information. It's sort of self-evident that if you have a website or an app that has documentation inside of it, that because it's inside the app and the app needs to conform to 301.549, then the documentation needs to conform to 301.549. What we think is meant here, and we wish this word was expressed more clearly, is that the third-party documentation and services are covered by this. So if you have an app or a website or whatever, and it has documentation that sits outside of it, you cannot exclude that from the scope of what you're doing. These are always included. We wish this was a little clearer. Because of this word included information, it almost seems like it only refers to documentation within the particular application or website, but that just didn't make sense. So after talking this through, the only real conclusion we came to is this means third-party documentation is included. That's documentation you host somewhere else. That is documentation that somebody else created for you that you reference. Whether that includes documentation that somebody else made that you had nothing to do with and you're not using, that's not entirely clear. But that's where we were. We kind of lost the communications need requirement in this. So there's no longer a requirement to accommodate the communication need of people with disabilities within support services, which on the one side seemed like a big loss, but thinking that through a little bit, it also seems like support services are covered themselves by EN 301.549 in a lot of scenarios. So even if there isn't a direct requirement that says your support services need to accommodate people with disabilities, which is a really vague thing to say, support services generally are covered by EN 301.549, and therefore they must conform to that, and that addresses that gap. We did spot a couple of other things that we thought would be good improvements to consider in the future. Findability did not seem to be included, so can you actually find the documentation that you might need? There's no requirements around two-way communication. Like if I need help, can I get it? Can I ask a human to provide that for me? There's nothing on the quality that the support services provides either, which that is a very important thing for accessibility too. So while they're not included, we wish something like that would be considered for a future edition. And that is all I had. And I think I stuck to my time.
Definitely. Very good, Wilco. We do not have any questions we have quite a few questions on 11.7, so we will make sure that we cover them in writing in the thank you email, so we don't take time now. And then we have a Now I have a general question for if you want to take that one, Wilco. So do you have a list of alternative measures that organizations can implement to ensure that this mean that all accessibility settings on a mobile platform and all web browsers need to be supported? And would this mean that do you have a list of alternative measures that organizations can implement to ensure that people with disabilities have equitable access to digital content in cases where there is not feasible for a regulated organization to comply with a specific requirement of the accessibility ICT standard? That's a wow.
I'm not sure I understand that question, other than I would recommend following 31549. That is a very good list of requirements that not only you should follow, but all the support services you hire should follow, and all of your documentation should comply to.
Yeah, very good answer. Thank you very much. And let's see if that so we have one question on 12.2. Are users with cognitive disability included as users for 12.2?
Yes, they are.
Perfect, thank you. And then we go on to Ditlev.
So let's see, I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we do.
I don't have control yet, I think. At least I can't, if I press arrow keys, it doesn't move to the next slide. Okay, so that seems to work. I hope that I can move forward in the presentation. The requirement our group was discussing is 12.3, accessibility and compatibility features. Doesn't seem, oh yeah. So the old or the current version of the EN 301549 says accessibility and compatibility features, product documentation provided with the ICT, whether provided separately or integrated with the ICT, shall list and explain how to use the accessibility and compatibility features of the ICT. So if we go to the next, there is not that much change. There is actually an addition of something that was prior in the last version, on the current version, only contained in Annex C, which tells us how to test requirements. And that is this bit where ICT includes product or service information. So that means that this information on accessibility and compatibility features is only required when the ICT has product or service information. And it raises the same question that Wilco just raised. What exactly is that? So we'll cover that in a minute. It also has an addition, and its features that facilitate compatibility with assistive technology, any accessibility provisions that are not met, as well as any available support service, including accessibility-specific support service. So it may actually take up some of the things that Wilco was lacking or was missing in the rewording of was it 12.2, I think, on technical documentation, because it explicitly includes those things here. Can you move on? Because I think I can't. Okay, so the remaining concerns were worked out in this workshop. You can move on to the next slide. The first thing is this precondition that it only applies if there's technical documentation on ICT documents or ICT or services. Product or service information. That is a problem because there are different interpretations of what that means. So I think it's quite clear that there are examples where everyone will agree that this is product or service information, for example, usage-oriented help, or information on keyboard shortcuts that an application may have, maybe from Google Mail and other similar web-based applications, that there are often shortcuts that can be that must be documented, that also you may be able to change and remap. So these things certainly covered. Also, something like an accessibility statement would be covered. But it's the gray area is in terms of more content-oriented information, like a content-oriented FAQ. Say you have a transport service that tells you something about what you do when you lose your ticket. Would that be product or service documentation? Some people will think it does, it should be included. Others think it's not actually information on the product, but on something that's contained, that's more content-oriented. Could you move on? So the next point that was open and discussed was the scope of accessibility features. We've heard about that as well. This discussion is dark mode an accessibility feature, and that member states have disagreements there. Also, I think Wilco already mentioned that are there self-documenting features? So if you have the typical contrast switch or a simple button to click on or activate to have smaller or larger text size, and you see immediately what happens, you press the, say, contrast button and you turn to a high contrast version, you click it again, you turn back to the default. Is that sufficiently self-documenting, or do you need an additional documentation for that? That's something that's not really clear right now. Also, can ICT rely on third-party documentation where it uses such functionality? So, for example, if you have a website, very frequent example, you have a chat, which is provided by some other third party. That may have documentation on how to use it, but that may not necessarily be or will often not be part of your product or service. So there may be documentation, but the documentation may not be good, it may not be accessible. Will that be included, or is it something that's basically scoped out here? And also defining what an accessibility feature is difficult. So examples would help. So for example, the whole case of overlays, these overlay providers where you can basically get a button and then you get a large Swiss knife of controls. Is that an accessibility feature, even if it may harm accessibility in some cases? That's an open question. So the next point, what must be documented? Is the well-labeled conventional feature like contrast switch already sufficiently documented? Or would you need extra documentation for such features so they can be found from the settings, for example? It may also be important for some users that don't see themselves as disabled but may still need those features, that they are explained what this actually does, for example, in the accessibility statement or somewhere in the settings. So that's not really clear how much and you must document things. And then how you document is another issue. It does not mandate that the documentation is accessible. That was a point made in the workshop, but I agree with Wilco and also with Susanna that this is really something that goes without saying and will be covered by other requirements. What is the best accessible place for documentation? That was discussed at length. Should it be inline, or can it be only inline? So as part of the control, maybe in a custom tooltip or something like that? Would it have to be in the settings, in the accessibility statement, or even as part of the onboarding process? Accessibility information was noted in the workshop as best provided prior to accessing the feature, so you know what you get. Also, some features like overlays may cause accessibility problems. So when you get to them, you may actually cause problems that prevent you from using the site or the content well. And then also another point was made, should it be simple language? Should there be some requirement that it's simple language? Testing is the last point, I think. If the precondition stays, we would need a clearer definition of what counts as product or service documentation. One possible guiding question for this, is the product and service documentation an integral part of the ICT? So is it only useful with reference to the functionality of the ICT, or is it something that is a standalone thing, like information on your tax returns or something, which could be provided in various forms? Another problem that was noted is it's not always easy to detect all available features. So there may be something that's hidden, like keyboard shortcuts, and you may have difficulty as a tester to find out where they are. And then also testing must include the documentation of third-party features, and that can be quite extensive, especially in things like overlays. You would have quite a task to include all that as well. I think that's it from me so far. If you can open to questions. We have only 1 minute left, so
Yes, so I think, thank you very much, Detlev. As we have only 1 minute left and we already have questions in the chat also around 11.7, so sorry for not being able to respond to all of that, but we will do our best to respond in writing. So very welcome to join us. And we have also got questions from people who want to join the next workshop, and that will be in Dublin on the 4th of February. So do make contact with IAAP if you would like to join the workshops, and I think you can find an email address on the next slide, hopefully, if there is a thank you slide. Yeah, you can email me, Susanna.Lorin, at the longest email address in the world, Accessibility Association in one word, .org. Not very good, but we're all on LinkedIn, so please do join us next time. Thank you very much to the facilitators and for everyone. I'm sorry to wrapping this up very quickly, but I have another webinar that I need to run, so we will stop at the top of the hour. We will try to respond to all of your questions afterwards, and do not hesitate to reach out to us if you would like to know more. We will continue with this for as long as we have the energy to keep working on the EN requirements, and do join us. It's the most nerdy but also the most popular things that we are doing. Thank you, everyone.
goodbye.